Okay, everybody, welcome to another edition of Product People's weekly community event where we try to fulfill one of our mission statements where we want to share knowledge generously with the product community, where we do so by bringing product leaders across the industry to help share their knowledge or a specific thing that they're currently working on. And thank you again for joining. I've mentioned this a couple of times for those that are new to this community. Please be aware that this is going to be recorded. So if you have your camera on and you are uncomfortable with the idea that maybe your face is recorded in this, please turn your cameras off so that that does not accidentally happen. Okay. So today we have someone special from HelloFresh, and we are going to be talking about how to build impactful products with confidence, one experiment at a time. I'm your host today, John Freeman. I've been with Product People for about 6 or 7 months now, but prior to that, I have done product and project management for about 5 years in a variety of different organizations. I'm a UCLA MBA, go Bruins. Other than that, I'm going to skip over me and I will allocate a bit more time to the actual presentation itself. And if you're new to what Product People is a consulting firm that provides in-house product managers acting on an interim basis in the event that there is a parental leave or perhaps there's a long lead time between having your previous product manager and hiring your new product manager. Now you have an opportunity to ensure that the train keeps moving, so to speak, because we come in and we run your day-to-day operations as well as helping with product discovery and helping with product operations, just to ensure again that during this interim period where your product does not have a product manager, we're filling that gap for you. Again, we do that on a minimum of a 3-month basis, but as long as is required by the organization. In addition to that, we have our Product People community where we host events like the one that you are currently attending to, again, help spread product knowledge generously so that people within our community can help improve their practices as being product managers and grow their skill set. And with that being said, before we get started, we have several questions that we'd like to pose to the audience. First and foremost, how many experiments do you run? Secondly, how many experiments conclusively validate your hypothesis? And third, how many successful experiments change your course of action? If you could please answer in the poll, and after, let's give it about a minute, I'll read off the results. Okay, and the results are in. It looks like the majority, 56%, run 1 to 2 experiments per month. Of those experiments, how many experiments conclusively validate your hypothesis? Maybe somewhere between 30 to 70%. I wish there was somebody with more than 70%. We'd love to hear from you. And then how many successful experiments change your course of action? Vast majority, less than 80%. And with that, we're going to introduce Nikolas Schriefer. He's the Director of Product Global AI at HelloFresh. Nikolas has an interesting background. He's both a musician as well as an economist by training, but instead of joining a normal company, he decided to start his own, and after 7 years had a very successful acquisition and has since been working in the startup space until finally arriving at his current position at HelloFresh. Brings with him a wealth of knowledge, in particular in the world of experimentation, and we're extremely excited to hear from him today. With that, Nikolas, I'm going to hand off the share screen function to you, and you're welcome to take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the introduction, John. Just finding the share screen. So I hope you can share my screen. Otherwise, please see my screen. Otherwise, please scream. Cool.
I can see your screen.
No screen. Good. Amazing. Yeah, thanks for the intro, and also thanks product people for the invitation to this event. I think it's really cool what you're doing for the community here. And thanks everybody for participating. It was great to see your answers to those questions, because that's obviously something that we would like to talk about today. I'm pretty passionate about this topic of experimentation. In fact, I think this is probably the most successfully repeatable way to build great products. And hopefully you'll agree, if not now, after the presentation, but also happy to discuss that with you all. It was great to see also from your answers, like you are all in like different stages of your journey in experimentation. So hopefully like we'll be able to touch on all of those a little bit during the presentation. This will be a bit more high level, but happy to also go deeper in the Q&A or even offline later. John already told you a little bit about myself. So as he mentioned, my background is all over the place. Studied music, studied economics, then started my own company where we essentially pivoted our way to product market fit, which we ultimately found by building an advertising tech solution with some reinforcement learning component at its core that was pretty good at allocating ad budgets across various creatives, target groups, and channels. We sold that company 3 years ago to a marketing agency from Berlin. After that, I defaulted to consulting, helped a couple other startups get off the ground, and at the beginning of this year, took this pretty exciting role at HelloFresh as the product director for the global AI team. All right, what can you expect in the next 15 to 20 minutes here? I essentially would like to talk about 3 different things. First of all, why do we even experiment? Why does it matter? What do we want to get out of it? What is an experiment? And you will see in my definition that is a bit on the broader side. And what should we take into account? What are the pitfalls? How can we make sure that experimentation actually works? All right, why should you care about any of this? If there's just one thing you walk away from this conversation or presentation today, it's this: like, don't run an experiment if the outcome of that experiment won't be able to change your course of action. Because ultimately, we want to use experiment to change the default thing we would have done without the experiment. And how do we do that? Well, the experiment helps us to increase confidence in the right decisions to take, like the decision which of the alternative paths we could take as a business, as a product team. And ultimately, that obviously fits into the space of de-risking assumptions, which I think to us product people, this is very dear to our heart, right? This is what we basically do every day. We try to de-risk our assumptions about how can we maximize customer value, usability, business viability, and feasibility for our teams. And I would argue if all we do as product managers is make sure that we run good experiments, then we come a very, very long way. Because ultimately, what's our responsibility as product people? Well, we want to figure out what's the right thing to build. I think that is Airbnb's definition of product discovery. And there's lots of famous examples, obviously great examples how experiments done go right and can lead to amazing results. I think one that I often recall here in different presentations is Microsoft Bing, where allegedly, but I think it's actually true, they changed just the order of the ad headlines that they display, and by that we're able to increase revenues by double-digit percentages. Of course, as is also seen earlier in the poll answers, that is not always the case. Actually, I'm not surprised that no one said that more than 70% of your experiments, or at least 70% of your experiments, conclusively validate the hypothesis. That would actually be really surprising to me. I think something between 30 and 70% is actually the sweet spot. If you're below 30%, then maybe it makes sense to think about how, like, where do your hypotheses come from? And how can you potentially increase the quality of inspiring hypotheses, coming up with the assumptions of what might be the right thing to do in order to proceed and advance with your business. The other picture, well, that is probably very familiar to all of you as well. This is from Eric Ries's book, The Lean Startup, where he talks about an MVP, a minimum viable product. And why is this important in the sense of experiments? Well, we have an idea, we build something, there's a product, we measure the results, we learn from that, and it's an iterative cycle that helps us learn step by step and always get better with the product that we build. Better meaning, again, delivering value to our customers in the way that are viable and helpful to our business as well. And I would actually change this picture a little bit and say, well, this minimum viable product is actually not a product. That is an experiment. So we have a hypothesis in the beginning. We build an experiment that allows us to validate, prove, or disprove, hopefully, that hypothesis. By that, we learn something and we can come up with new ideas how to iteratively improve the products that we build. Okay, so now we hopefully have an idea of why would we want to do experiments, ultimately to change the course of action. Again, that was actually maybe a bit surprising to see that the answer of the last question that you guys answered. There are quite a few people where less than 80% of their successful experiments, so those where you can conclusively actually validate a hypothesis, they don't end up rolling this out. They don't end up making a change. Well, that would be, well, pretty important, I think, to think about this from the get-go, and we'll see that when we go into the how of the experimentation a little bit in a couple of minutes. So what is all this magic? How can we make this why happen? This gets a bit technical now, like my definition of an experiment. I think it's important because it also explains how I see this, and you will see on the next slide that allows us to package a lot of things under experiments and not just A/B tests or split tests, as you might be familiar with. For me, an experiment is something that we do, a procedure that helps us to learn about the effect of something that we can control, right? We can change the product in a certain way. And that informs decisions, business or technical decisions, to move forward, to roll out one or the other variant, for example. Ultimately, that's the same thing. So the outcome of the experiment prescribes what we should do, and it does that with confidence if we conclusively validate a hypothesis that we have. So in the end, this is very much like science, where we test falsifiable hypotheses so we can support or refute them. So when I was saying my definition of experiment is broad, this is why I was saying this. And to some of you, this might now look a bit more like different user research methods. And it is. This is also, I think, a way you could display different UXR activities. And the top right of this 2x2 matrix here, the way how we can quantitatively figure out what people do with A/B tests and split tests, that is probably where most people put the standard experiment definition when they hear, okay, like we're running experiments at this company. I would argue there's a lot more you can do. As long as we, going back here, like do something that we try to learn about the effect, things that we can do to our business, to our products, that will change the course of action. And there's other things we can do. We can analyze the data, for example, from product analytics that we have. We can build prototypes. We can analyze how our customers behave with our products in different ways, for example, by using heat maps. We can also run MVP experiments, maybe in the narrower sense, like a concierge service, or you might have heard or used this word Wizard of Oz type of user research or experiment. You can do user tests, and you can even do things where you don't directly track what people are doing, but rely on what they are saying to you. You can do user interviews. You can do surveys. And I would argue all of these qualify as experiments as long as we are really clear about the hypothesis that we want to validate and also clear about our methods. And that's the next section here. So we talked about why do we run an experiment? We want to change our course of actions by gaining confidence in the assumptions that we have and making good decisions based on that. What do? Well, we have a variety, a breadth of different activities that we can do in order to achieve that. They all involve some kind of a learning procedure. So how do we do this? And how do we do this in a way that this is fast? Because we want to learn fast, like in the agile cycle displayed by Eric Ries and the Lean Startup. And we also want to do this reliably. We want to be able to trust the experiment results, and we want to trust the decisions that we as product teams make or suggest to our leadership. So one template that I've come up with over the last couple of years, and involves a couple of different points when designing or setting up an experiment. And I want to walk through these briefly one by one and then spend a bit more time on the hypothesis part. So first of all, as usually in probably most documents, you have a summary. I think the important part here is that the summary is evolving. So when you just are about to design the experiment, you would write about what you are planning to do. After the experiment has run, you have the results. The summary will obviously look a lot like the conclusion in your experiment doc. Then the hypothesis, we'll spend a bit more time on that in a minute. The third part, motivation, I find this quite interesting. A lot of times this is not included in any kind of experiment templates that I have seen before. But I like to ask the teams that I work with, like, why do you think this is a good idea? Like, what is the impact behind this? Why are we even running this experiment? Also, do we have any data that suggests, like, any evidence that we have? It might just be anecdotal evidence or descriptive evidence that this might work. So what is the whole reasoning behind this? Because usually at some point you will need to make trade-off decisions, like with any other product prioritization that you do, and we'll also have to prioritize different experiments against each other. Then the fourth and probably most verbose part of your experiment template is usually the experiment setup or experiment design. The success criteria would usually take what you have in the hypothesis as the primary metric that you're tracking. Again, we'll get there. But it also is important to think about the magnitude, for example, of the impact, the effect that you're trying to measure, the confidence level, statistical significance if you're actually running an A/B test, any guardrail or health metrics, any other things that you need to track in order to finally call the experiment a success. And very connected to that and to what we've already talked about a while now, like, that one thing that I want you to take away is those planned future actions. What are you going to do based on the different potential outcomes, possible outcomes of your experiment? And it's really important to get very specific about that and get alignment on that, commitment on that from everybody before. Because the worst thing is you run an experiment, it's the results are conclusive, you want to roll out, and there's some reason, some constraint, could be a legal constraint, some other constraint, where you cannot even roll this out. And you could have known this before. Then you just wasted a lot of time and effort by running an experiment. Targeting, I think, is a bit simpler. It's like the audience, who are you actually reaching with this experiment? Treatment is, what are you doing to them specifically? Like, do you have different types of treatment? Do you have a control group, which you would usually have in a classical A/B setting or split or ABN setting at least? Timeline, also here, very important to get alignment. Oftentimes you have dependencies on other product teams or commercial teams about how and when specifically to run experiments, because they change the experience for your users that also others depend on. And then very concretely, how do you deploy the experiment and how do you track it? And obviously, before you run, you should also test that all this tracking works properly. Point 5 and 6, of course, you will not fill this out before the experiment starts. You do that at the end. You collect all the results and you interpret them. It's not just about writing down, oh, this is what we see, but what do we believe this means? And then, of course, you go back to the success criteria, to hypothesis, and to the actions. And hopefully the next step that you then suggest or take as a product team is one of the ones you had outlined before even starting the experiment in the planned or possible future actions to take. Diving a bit deeper into the hypothesis, one way to phrase the hypothesis here, which I have found to work in probably 90% of the cases, when it goes like this, is it's like something that we want to do, the proposed change. We believe that will increase or decrease a certain metric that we can track for a subset of our users, for this target audience, because we have done some data analytics in the past that showed XYZ. We have seen a competitor doing something similar. There was a change in the industry, market change, that inspired us to come up with this assumption or idea. And this metric that you're trying to drive, of course, that is a very crucial central part of your hypothesis statement. Ideally, I would say usually that is some kind of a KPI that your team is tracking. If you use the OKR framework, that is usually, could be a key result, could be a leading indicator in your key result. Like, of course, this should be something that ultimately impacts the outcomes or the goals that your team has, whether like directly the North Star goal that you might have, which is not always, or actually in the rarest cases that is possible, or you can maybe have in your head kind of a KPI tree, and this is a metric that then leads into that. Quick example here. If we imagine a checkout form, which for checkout funnel, which probably most of us have seen at some point, a classical e-commerce thing. You know that oftentimes you have to enter your email twice. You get it once, and then you will be asked to confirm your email address. So you can imagine a hypothesis that goes like, well, if we remove that confirmation, that second form, we will increase the checkout conversion rate by at least 5%. So that I would already have an idea about the quantification, and that should definitely go to the part of where you define the success criteria more. But you can, of course, prove a hypothesis that the conversion rate increases by any amount. So that is the metric you want to drive. You want to do this on a particular subset of your audience, on repeat customers. And you think this can be pre-filled from a previous visit. That's why this is a good idea. So this goes like the same method here, proposed change, increases metric, what this uses, because reason. All right, now we talked about the why, the what, the how. This next thing, I thought I'd put this in the how, but I think this is so important that I wanted to pay like special attention. And I think this is a really key ingredient to create a successful experimentation program at any company, and that is culture of experimentation. So it's not enough if you just like there's a couple of people who want to do experimentation. Like it really needs the whole company to be bought into that and to take a great effort to make this a successful program and use experimentation as one of the key means to build impactful products. And I feel that there's 4 main ingredients to make the culture work for you. One is enable the company, make it easy for people to run experiments. That is much easier said than done. This is about providing the right tools, frameworks. Sometimes you just start with a couple of guidelines. You start with a template like this one, like, hey, like we can help you run experiments. You can do this quicker because you just have to fill out this template. You don't have to do from scratch all the time. And then ultimately, if your company is in a bit of a later stage, you will do things like you will think about having an experimentation platform team that either in-house or builds a platform or licenses something from a vendor and then builds some tooling around it. Another very important part in my mind is education. And what I've seen work well there is to nominate some champions, or sometimes they're called bar raisers across the organization, that help teams run experiments well, help them with the setup, help them with the execution, help them with the interpretation, and then share the knowledge, like bring people together, some kind of a experimentation roundtable, internal meetup, or even external, like meet up with other companies as well, like really share the knowledge. And that goes together actually with the 4th point here, also share the wins. Very important, like to celebrate together when experimentation, or like in Microsoft Bing's case, but it can also be obviously smaller wins that you should celebrate together. And then last but not least, like really ingrain experimentation culture into the core values, into the DNA of your business. Like 2 of the main values at HelloFresh are learning never stops and data-drivenness, which obviously feed directly into what we want to do with experimentation. Before I close, you might have noticed that this was quite high level. Right? I wanted to provide an introduction and some main thoughts around like what is important to get started with experimentation or to kind of advance a little bit on your journey. There's a lot of points I have deliberately left out of this presentation. I want to just, when I thought about this, when I put together the slides, I was like, okay, like these are things I have in my head. Maybe I should at least mention them. So that's exactly what I will do. I will mention a couple of points. Maybe there will be some questions about this that we can dive deeper, or also, again, like happy to chat about this more going forward. Complicated if you get deeper into your experimentation journey. The first thing is maybe already one of the most complicated here. Predicted targets. What does that mean? Well, let's think about an experiment where you change something in your product, which you believe will then increase the value of the customers that you acquire, or the value of the customers that you already have, both as possible. Customer value, well, that's a tricky thing, right? If you are both a subscription business or a transactional business, but customers can buy multiple times something in the future, then something like lifetime value of the customer is obviously only defined over a very long time horizon. But you don't want to wait weeks, months, or even years to conclusively evaluate and call your experiment. So what you can do here is you can do some tricks. You can use machine learning, for example, to predict the future value of the customer early on. That is something, it sounds easy on the surface. Like you build a lifetime value prediction model, you plug it into your experimentation platform, and once the customer converts, you get a predicted value for the customer in a year's time, 2 years' time, and you use that to call your experiments. I put this thing here, like proceed with caution, because this is already one of those things which is actually statistically not so easy to do. Another point, we touched on it a little bit, like platforming. I think here's where if you're a bit down the line, you will get into build versus buy decisions, build and buy decisions, how I see them often as well. Like you license something from an external vendor, but they don't provide all the functionality that you need. So you build something around it, which I see happen more and more in many, like I would say, like scale up stage companies. Then you can get into topics, discussions around advanced statistics. You might have heard about those two different schools of thoughts, the frequentists and the Bayesians. Like, I don't want to go into too much detail here, but that is both you can definitely use to evaluate experiments. Maybe you should even use both to have different perspectives on the outcome of an experiment. And then the last thing is not always an experiment, or in this particular case, an A/B test is the right thing to do. There might be situations where you want to use other means to optimize the behavior of your product or how users and customers behave with your products. There is, for example, other machine learning techniques, reinforcement learning techniques. Bandits is one of those. Like before would be multi-armed bandits. Literally comes from those slot machines in Vegas, where you have different slot machines and you try to figure out, okay, which has the biggest payoff? And you test those. You test machine 1, machine 2, machine 3, machine 4, machine 1 again. Oh, machine 1 gave you a bit more than machine 4. Well, then maybe that is it. Oh, now it doesn't give you as much. And you test a different machine. There's a different technique to figure out which of the variants outperforms others without being so conclusive as A/B tests are, and also without giving you the diagnostic power, but oftentimes giving you a faster way to optimize. And yeah, I just want to kind of promote some, like my own article here. I wrote about this actually a few years ago. If you Google for when and when not to A/B test, you'll probably find an article that I wrote where I laid this out in a lot more detail. It's fairly technical, when to use one or the other, and some thoughts about this whole topic. Also happy, obviously, to dive into some of this now or later. So with that, I think we already somewhat arriving at the Q&A stage. Also, you can find me on Twitter or now X and LinkedIn. Happy to connect with you all and dive deeper into your experimentation journey. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nikolas. If you would go ahead and stop sharing your screen, I will share mine again. Just give me one moment, folks, while I get my screen prepared. Okay. And can we all see, thank you for listening, Q&A? Okay,
Yes.
Fantastic. Awesome, folks. So regardless of what platform that you're on, be it LinkedIn, be it YouTube, maybe you're here with us on Zoom, please feel free to start entering your questions that you have for Nikolas. And what we're going to do in the background is we're going to consolidate those questions, and then I will ask those questions on your behalf. In the meantime, as those are rolling in, I'm going to tell you a bit more about Product People. So again, Product People is a product consulting firm, and what we do is we offer interim and fractional product management. What that means is, in the event that there is a gap between when you had a product manager running the show and when they will return, be it because there's a parental leave, be it because there's a long lead time between your previous product manager exiting and the new one being onboarded, regardless of what the why behind the what is, if you need somebody to fill that gap, that is where we come in. We also provide product coaching and consulting. We've gathered a ton of information about best practices and how to implement them within an organization, and we are offering coaching and consultation in order to help bring those best practices to your organization. And last but not least, we definitely do product discovery work as well, helping your company go from 0 to 1. What we're not doing, we're not recruiters. We don't look for people on your behalf. Everybody, and we're not a freelance marketplace. Everybody that works for Product People is an employee of Product People. And what that means is we're able to offer product management as a service. When you hire me, for example, to work in your organization, you're not just getting me, you're getting a team of product persons, product people, to work on your product, so that in the event that I go on vacation, somebody is there to support your organization. We keep the train moving. You know, there's no lapse in that service. Again, product management as a service provided by Product People. And we are not a development or a design agency, but we will work with your development and design agencies as in the same way a product manager would, as a full-time product manager in your org. Here's a list of some of our B2C clients, some big names that you may have heard of. I know I use Blinkist often, helps me get through some interesting material quickly. And some of our B2B clients that you may recognize, including the WHO. We have a lot of positive feedback from our clients. We tend to get fantastic results, and people like to work with us. We'd love to share that. And some interesting stats about us, something that we are very particularly proud of is that we have a very, we have a lot of women working in the organization, and 66% of the women in our organization are part of the leadership, which is pretty unique. Very unique in terms of the organizations I've worked for in the past as well. And we're all very friendly, amazing, good-looking people. Don't we look awesome? Don't you want to work with us? I do. And if you want to work with us, we're also hiring as well. This link will be provided at the end. And of course, if somebody wants to ping me on LinkedIn, you're more than welcome to do so. And I'll happily discuss that with you as well. With that being said, we'll now switch over to the Q&A. Again, if you have any questions, regardless of what platform, please submit those questions via the chat function in that platform. First question, are there any other methods to speed up testings besides ML?
Great question. Yes, I would actually also not look at ML starting out to speed up testing. I think there's a lot of more procedural things that you can do in terms of helping your organization figure out how to quickly set up, design an experiment, and roll it out. I would probably start to narrow down the problem space a bit more and try to figure out, like, is there a gap in coming up with new experiments? Is there a gap in designing them? Is it an engineering problem to actually roll out, to deploy experiments? Or is there a gap in the analytical thing? Like, is there, for example, a time lag between the experiment is done and the decision is being made? And then try to really figure out, like, what solution can you apply to each of those different stages. ML, well, helps you, once your experiment is over, to get quicker to the decision, because you essentially you can swap out the metric that you're looking at. ML can obviously also help you with some other parts of the experimentation piece, for example, in terms of distributing the audiences. But generally, like, I don't think my first answer wouldn't be use ML for everything, but really try to narrow down where exactly is the problem and how can you address that in any meaningful way. And oftentimes it's around education and it's around processes and tools that the organization needs.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Next question. How do you manage the balance between innovation and relying on A/B testing results?
That's an interesting question. I am interpreting that in a way that A/B tests will often only get you incremental changes, versus maybe a big leap you're trying to get through some innovative new invention. I'm not sure if the person wants to elaborate, otherwise I'll just try to take it into that direction. So first of all, I'm a big believer in compounding results. So if we make little things often in the right direction, I think they can actually get us very far. Sometimes I agree though, like, experimentation is not the answer to everything, especially in the early stages of a business where you don't have product market fit yet. I think the companies are usually in different stages. In the beginning, you will basically throw a lot of things at the wall, figure out what sticks, and do also more radical pivots. And then later on, if an organization scales, especially at the stage where HelloFresh is at, it's much more about optimization. And that is where experimentation then really shines. But I think I wouldn't neglect it even in the beginning. There's a lot of things also when I look back at my startup days that we did where we had big ideas and we were actually able to figure out what is the core hypothesis, the core assumption in this big idea, like this riskiest assumption kind of concept, and then design an experiment that would test only that. And that would actually give us a lot of confidence going into that direction, because otherwise it might take us a lot of time to figure out that something works or doesn't work. I hope that helped.
We actually got feedback in the chat that you hit the nail on the head. You answered exactly what the asker was asking.
Perfect.
Awesome. Next question. So it's clear to me that if you have separate teams performing the experiment and such then documentation helps. But if the development team is also performing the experimentation, then it can sometimes feel like there's too much documentation, too much overhead. What's your view to help embed the documentation within tools such as Jira?
I think that's a great idea. I think making documentation lightweight, easily accessible, and not an annoyance is very important. I think though there's no world where we cannot have documentation. And it's not just about our team and other teams, but it's about our team reading the documentation from 2 months ago. Because we forget, and it's the classic, why do developers have documentation? Why does the code need to be readable? Well, because for ourselves, we go back in 3 months and want to look, hey, wasn't there an experiment that we did here that answered that question that we had? Oh, and there's no documentation about it. So what do we do? So I think documentation is a must, but I totally agree with trying to integrate it into your processes so that it is lightweight. Helps a ton, helps with the adoption of the documentation, helps with it being rigorous and good, helps with it being discoverable, really important. Like if you have documentation that is just flying around somewhere, but like if you want to find it, you cannot find it. I guess this is not such a big problem with like keyword search and either Confluence or Google or whatever you use, but still, I think this is a great thing. Like implement this into your workflow, would definitely encourage that.
Yeah, awesome. Simple, simple, simple. I like simple too. How do you set your metrics with regards to hypotheses? For example, why would you suggest a 5% increase makes sense versus something else in those when setting those metrics?
Yeah, very good question. I think it's essentially two questions that I hear. One is what is the right metric, and then what is the effect size that we are looking for that to matter. And I think both are important discussions to have before running the experiment. What is the right metric? I usually try to, I think I mentioned this earlier, I have this KPI tree in my head. Ultimately, we might have a North Star metric for a team or maybe for the whole company. And we try to figure out what are the levers that we can impact as a product team or a specific product team that ultimately are leading indicators into that overarching metric that we want to achieve. I think you need to have this clear link and also confidence about the causality of those links, and that confidence you can build with experimentation as well, that one metric influences the other, so that you know that if you influence this one leading indicator, ultimately in a months, weeks down the line, like as a lagging point, that North Star metric will be impacted. So that's how I would look about how to choose the right metric. In terms of the magnitude of the impact you're going for, like I have this concept in my head, I call this practical significance, to not confuse it with statistical significance. Like when does this matter for the company? And of course, this is very subjective and very much dependent on the size of the business, the overarching OKRs that you have. You can probably read a little bit from that if you're using OKR frameworks, like what's the level of ambition you're going for. And also what are the competing priorities? What are the competing other experiments or initiatives that you could be doing in that time? Right? It's the same thing with if you prioritize your overall initiatives, you usually do some kind of an ICE score, you have impact in there somewhere. So you would assess what is the presumed impact of that one experiment that you can do versus the other experiment. And that way you would relatively stack rank them, and then try to prioritize the ones that hopefully have the best impact to effort and setting confidence aside ratio.
Yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, definitely mapping out your leading and lagging indicators, I think is absolutely crucial as well. Seeing how everything's going to impact everything. I've got a question. So we were talking about motivation, and so what I've seen in the past is once a culture of experimentation is coming about, that gets a little bit of excitement, right? A lot of experiments start flying at you from a lot of different directions, and for us as product people, as product managers, it can be difficult to cut through the wheat and find the chaff, so to speak. I think I'm saying that phrase right, but maybe not. Regardless, do you have any sort of standard criterion or something that you can propose for the organization, such that when they're offering an experiment, that it comes with a set of standard data points, so to speak, so that that experiment can be evaluated appropriately? Or do you take it more as an ad hoc, you see the experiment and you make that assessment yourself? How do you handle that?
Quick question back to you. When you say evaluate the experiment, you're talking about evaluate whether you want to run the experiment in the first place?
Correct.
Okay. And so your problem statement is that there's a lot of appetite in running experiments. You get a lot of people who wanted to do that, but there's some kind of resource constraint on the product team and you need to prioritize.
Correct.
All right. So ultimately, in my world, the prioritization decision is the decision of the product team. And it is also the obligation of the product team to gather all the data required to make that decision in the best possible way. And I think it will sound similar to my last answer, but if I think about like how would I now prioritize that as a team, is again looking at impact and effort primarily. Maybe we can tackle the effort side a bit more here, because something that you could do in working with your stakeholders or experiment owners in the company who want to run experiments, like how can you break it down? How can we make this easier? How can you make this faster? And then once you get to a point where you actually get all those requests, you actually already run a lot of experiments, you see the value of the experimentation, like then it's probably also time to invest in tooling or maybe platforming, so that can be a much more fluid and quasi self-service offering for your stakeholders and the experimentation customers then in the organization.
And when an organization reaches that point, have you used various tools? What would you recommend as like a tool that is best suited for running an experimentation program, if you will, within an organization?
There's lots of different vendors out there. I don't want to promote any specific vendor right now, but I think if you Google for that so much about not promoting a vendor like Google. If you search for any like experimentation platform, you will find a few out there. At some point, this will get this build or buy or build and buy decision that you will run into. It's like you can take something off the shelf, implement this. We will probably be able to solve a lot of your problems with it, but not all of them. And then you have to figure out what to do there. But there are a lot of solutions out there that help you get a long way.
I'll search ChatGPT and we'll see how that goes.
That might work.
So how can we integrate qualitative data such as user feedback and usability testing with quantitative experimentation results to gain a more holistic understanding of user preferences?
Very good and very deep question. So yeah, here we are mixing two important pieces of trying to figure out what's the right thing to build, just obviously user research, which might be more qualitative, the more qualitative thing that you're referring to, and then the experimentation traditionally more quantitative, although when I showed you that map of different experiments, they were kind of all mixed together. I tend to think about it like qualitative research often helps us to find the right questions to ask. And it also helps us to find what is wrong. It doesn't get us to a level of confidence or statistical significance like with quantitative research, but it's often a good first, more than, I wanted to say indicator, but it's actually more than an indicator. It helps us, I think, already narrow down our problem space a lot. So, I mean, definitely agree with those to combine those different techniques that you have at hand. And especially with user interviews or even surveys. So interviews, well, you can get to a sizable sum there. So they might even be quantitative to a certain extent, more so the survey part, like you can do user surveys. You have to be a bit careful how you then analyze it. But if you run them in a very structured way, so that is probably maybe the one advice I want to give. Like, it might be obvious, but like really like ask the same question so that you're able to, in the end, maybe you can collect 100, maybe like 1,000 different answers to a survey that you run. That can actually even give you quantitative insights into your user base.
Awesome. Thank you for that answer. Something that I was thinking about when developing, again, the culture of experimentation within an organization and kind of getting the ball moving, what are sort of instant opportunities to maybe help the organization see the benefit of experimentation? Would you recommend maybe doing some on the side as kind of a side hustle, side project within the organization, or do you propose going forward to the powers that be, so to speak, to start allocating budget early? How do you propose beginning that process?
So you're thinking about a company that is really just getting started. There's no culture of experimentation yet. There's essentially no experimentation being run. So I would then start with experimentations that are with experiments or experiment methods that are easier to pull off and maybe also closer to what the organization is used to, like the more quantitative user research methods. Like do customer interviews, but do customer interviews already phrased as an experiment. So have a hypothesis that when going into customer interviews, when going into surveys, and then you will analyze those and potentially present them to leadership at the company or the people around, and they will pick up problems like, okay, how sure are you? Like, why are we not going in that way? And then the answer could be, like, we have a lot of good indication here, but we can't be sure because we haven't actually done an A/B test that we should run now to validate this assumption that we have, or to get more confidence about this assumption that we have, because some you will already have from the user interviews and or surveys that you have run. So I think really start with those things that are, I think, more natural and that all we product managers do anyway, like speak with our users, but try to bring more structure and rigor to the way how we extract insights from the conversations we have with users or the interactions that we have with users. Descriptive analytics might be another way to actually get into that. Like look at the product analytics and figure out, there's even ways you can actually do causal analysis from historical data, the whole topic of causal inference, which is something that you could also look into, but maybe at that stage when you're not running a lot of experiments, might also not have the volumes of data that allow you to do this properly. So I guess this is a little bit chicken and egg problem at that stage.
For sure. Thank you for that answer. Is there any difference in strategies to employ when conducting experiments with long-term goals in mind versus short-term goals?
Long-term goals being, for example, what I shared earlier, and trying to maximize customer lifetime value or value over a longer period of time, probably.
The asker has an example, as in how can we increase usage rate of this feature versus how can we foster greater brand loyalty or increase customer lifetime value?
Yeah, okay. So the lifetime value, I think, is the example that I brought earlier. Customer loyalty is a similar one. Brand recall is another one, which has probably very long-term effects. I guess the short answer is it's hard, unfortunately, to do this properly and to be able to get good results that you are confident in the short term if you are actually going for long-term impact. The way to use predictive targets with machine learning was one example, but also that is not easy and requires a lot of data for you to be able to build this. There are some ways you can actually shortcut this a little bit with the help of outside like external companies. For example, in the advertising space, the big advertisers, they actually have models as well that can help you. So maybe you can rely on data that you don't have in your own organization yet from your own users, but others have that, and they might be similar to their behavior might be similar to those users in your organization. You can draw from that. So like those guys, big advertising platforms will not give you that data, but they will happily take yours and then tell you how potentially your users are similar to others. So they will help you figure that out.
Awesome. Next question. I think many orgs have the misconception that MVPs are a mini version of the product. To me, an MVP is an experiment to validate the most high-risk assumptions. Would you agree with this comment?
I do definitely agree with the second half of the comment that the MVP should rather be a minimum viable experiment that allows you to answer any assumptions. I think starting with the riskiest first is the right approach to, well, not waste resources. I don't know about the many organizations who have this perceptions. Maybe I haven't seen enough organizations. I have seen some that do, so maybe I tend to agree there as well.
Awesome. I think next question, I definitely have another one. So something that you mentioned earlier is that there's certain types of experimentation that don't really work until you're at a point where you're trying to optimize, right? A/B tests may not make as much sense early on as you're trying to still find product market fit. But they may make sense later as you're iterating on a particular feature and so on. When you are early on, with your experience, what are the types of experiments that have you personally found most impactful in helping you make the appropriate decision to drive your product forward?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think about this whole map of experiments. Like there's a couple that have really helped me also in the startup days. One that immediately comes to mind is this notion of the concierge service or Wizard of Oz type, where essentially it's fake it till you make it. You provide the perception that you have something automated, you have a full product, but then in the end, you're actually running a lot of manual work behind the scenes. That is something definitely done a lot. Like when we built our first ad tech product, we didn't have all the APIs hooked up to the different services to actually go into the UIs of the services, set up the campaigns, but the kind of UI for the customer was perceived in a way that this was all automated behind the scenes. So that I think is really helpful to validate this, like first, and I think most important, product risk about customer value. Like how can you provide customer value? Because you can do this without having the full or even a small version of the product already. Like also getting back to this, like what is the MVP? In this case, I'm not sure, maybe because of product, maybe this is actually a service, not a product behind the scenes. Well, that is one experiment type that has really helped. However, then also A/B tests, I think they can also help early on. I recall an instance where also my old company, we had a pretty radical idea to make the whole funnel that was necessary to set up a campaign much shorter. So essentially from like 10 steps, a lot of big forms where you upload all your assets and material to almost a one-click kind of experience. And then we did an A/B test, and we had an assumption on a particular group that this would work well. And 70% of the people ended up choosing that. And the people who chose that had a more than 100% increase on the number of campaigns that they ran with us, and also on the revenue that they would essentially make themselves, and we got a cut of that. So I think even early on, you can think about this type of A/B test experiments.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. We have one final question, and then that'll be it for the Q&A session. So thank you, everybody that provided your questions. Final question of the night: how do you approach the implementation of significant changes following successful testing? Are there any strategies you suggest for getting teams ready even before results are available? How can you facilitate a smoother transition for cultural changes within the company during this process?
Yeah, it's a big question.
Big final question.
I try to trim this down as to like, yeah, how do you make sure that if you actually do run a successful experiment in the end, you can also act on it? And that really comes down to the communication before the experiment. So really aligning with everybody who is needed to make this final rollout decision before you start the experiment, and be very clear about what happens if. Like, it means like, if we see this result, we will do this. If we see that result, we will do that. And like everybody commit on it, align on it. Again, documentation, document this decision, please, so you can go back to it. Because there will be people even after, no, there's other things. But it's like, hey, like we all agreed here that this is what we're going to do once the results come in. I think that is the most important part. And that doesn't only get you there, but I think this is also actually that helps you make better decisions, because the decisions then are not biased by the outcome of the results that people are seeing. This happens, I think, implicitly to all of us. It's like the availability bias, that like you see something happening and then, oh yeah, this must be because, but maybe this because wasn't even answered by the experiment. So really defining very clearly beforehand what will happen when you see certain results, and getting alignment and agreement from everybody on that. I think that's the main way how to assure that your conclusive experiments will also make it to rollout stage.
Awesome final answer. Very much appreciated. Well, thank you everybody for joining, and a special thank you to you, Nikolas, for providing such awesome information to us. I loved your presentation. I know I learned a lot. I believe our audience did as well, given the awesome questions that we received. And we appreciate everybody for your participation. Evan, if you wouldn't mind dropping the links into the chat. If anybody is interested in following us on LinkedIn, Meetup, we conduct these weekly. So next week there'll be another speaker with another topic. Please feel free to join us. These are free knowledge sharing sessions, and again, it's part of our mission at Product People to ensure that we're sharing knowledge generously, and we hope that we are doing that with these weekly meetings. If you're interested in working with us, please check out our website, getproductpeople.com, and please check out our greenhouse link if you are interested at working for Product People. And of course, you can reach out to me personally if you have any questions about Product People or about working here. I'm happy to facilitate that conversation. Thank you all again. We'll be ending the live stream now. We ask everybody to please exit, and Nikolas, as we discussed